everyone, and welcome to another session of Bible Unlocked Live. It's really great to see you all here, and thanks for joining us today. We're going to delve into a fascinating topic tonight, and our topic is, did the Bible predict Israel's rebirth? Israel's constantly in the news, but for millennia, Israel wasn't even a nation. So in this session, we'll walk through how it became a nation again, how Bible scholars long before the 20th century knew this would happen. So joining me tonight is Jake, a regular contributor to Bible Unlocked, and he's going to guide us through this remarkable story. So here's how tonight's going to flow. Jake's going to begin with his main presentation. Did the Bible really predict Israel's rebirth? That's probably about a 15 or 20-minute presentation. And after that, we'll take a short break for our segment of the week and look at another of the practical lessons that come from the commandments of Christ. Tonight's segment is titled, Seek Peace Over Spreading Gossip. And finally, we'll return for our Digging Deeper session, where I'll ask Jake a few follow-up questions and we'll hear from you in the chats. So if everything goes according to plan, we'll wrap up in about half an hour. So Jake, welcome this evening. And why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and then dive right in.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I am a field service engineer from Brantford, Ontario, and I recently graduated from university last year. But far more importantly, I am a Bible student and a Bible scholar. And as Dan mentioned tonight, we are going to be considering a very interesting topic about Israel's rebirth. And did this get predicted by the Bible? And did people look into the Bible and predict it themselves? That's where we're going to dive into. And as Dan mentioned also, Israel is a nation that's constantly in the news, probably even today. And for centuries, they weren't even a nation. Even for millennia, they were scattered throughout the whole world. But tonight we're going to look at how they came back and became a nation and how this was prophesied in the Bible. Now, the first question we need to ask when considering a topic like this is why does it matter? Why does it matter that Israel is a nation? And we find the answer to that question, if we go back to Genesis and we go look at one of the first people to ever be given a promise from God, and that man is Abraham. And Abraham is told in Genesis chapter 13, verses 14 to 15, that he and his seed would inherit all the land that was around him, all the land that he saw to the north, the south, the east, and the west. God says, all that land that thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. And now Abraham is in Bethel at this time. You can see that spot marked in blue on the map there. And so if you look at the areas that were promised to him, if you go north, south, east, and west from Bethel, you get this general outline of the land that God promised to Abraham. And then if you go to Genesis 15, just a couple chapters later, you learn a little bit more about the boundaries of the land. It says, in the same day that the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, Unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates. And these are interesting rivers in Abraham's life because this is the route that he took on his journey of faith. If you read in Joshua chapter 2, Joshua says that your fathers, he's talking to the nation of Israel, lived beyond the Euphrates. That was Terah, the father of Abraham and of Nahor, and they served other gods. Then God took your father Abraham from beyond the river, that's the river Euphrates, and led him through all the land of Canaan and made his offspring many. And this yellow line here is kind of the journeys that Abraham took. He went all the way down into Egypt a couple times, which is where you'd find the Nile River. And that is what the river of Egypt is referring to there in Genesis 15. He came from Euphrates and he went all the way down into Egypt a few times. And he spent a lot of time in between as well. And so these are the boundaries of the land that was promised by God to Abraham, that he would inherit forever. Now, later in Genesis, Abraham's grandson Jacob, who is the actual father of the 12 tribes of Israel, his name is actually later changed to Israel, he has these promises reinstated in Genesis chapter 28. In Genesis 28, it says that the land wherein thou liest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed. Thy seed shall be as the dust of the earth. Thou shalt spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south. And the place where he's given this promise is also in Bethel, exactly where Abraham was given the promise to. And so we know then that for the promises to be fulfilled in truth and fullness, and God never lies, that the ancient land of Israel, which was formerly known as Canaan, had to remain Israel's inheritance forever. It just has to. Abraham and Jacob were promised this, and also Isaac, which we didn't look at, but he's also promised this. But all throughout history, the land of Israel has been a very hot commodity. The first major captivity was from the Assyrians, who came down and took northern Israel into captivity. And they left behind a group of 5 nations, which became known as the Samaritans. And then, not long after, when Babylon took over Assyria, they finished off Israel's captivity by taking the southern state, which was known as Judah. And for years, the Israelites stayed in Babylon under the Persians, and then the Persians got, under the Babylonians, and the Babylonians got invaded by the Persians, and Cyrus, the king of Persia, allowed them to return to Israel and build up their nation again as a vassal state. And there they remained in Israel under the rule of the Persians until the Greeks and eventually the Romans invaded and conquered Persia. Under Roman rule, the Jews remained in Israel through the New Testament, all through the life of Christ, all through the life of the apostles, until in AD 70, the Romans, under a man named Titus, destroyed Jerusalem to quell the Jewish revolts that had been springing up for 4 years against Roman authority. And after that, with the Jews' cultural and religious epicenter destroyed, the Jews were scattered across the world. These people were called the diaspora. And pockets of Jews that settled themselves in Europe, Asia, Africa, even as far as the Americas, they were spread worldwide. And so the Romans slowly removed the Jewish influence from the land of Israel. And for hundreds, even thousands of years, the promises that were made to Abraham and to Jacob looked like maybe they wouldn't be fulfilled after all. But the Bible demanded that they would be. And both Jews and true Bible scholars alike, from AD 70 all the way into the late 1800s and early 1900s, clung to a few prophecies that said this scattered people would return to their land again. And we're going to look at a couple of them. There's too many for us to consider all in one evening, but I've just picked out a couple that help highlight this for us. One such prophecy is found in a very interesting and a very graphic vision that the prophet Ezekiel was shown in Ezekiel 37. It's this vision of a valley that's full of dead men's dried out bones. But throughout the course of the vision, Ezekiel sees these bones covered in muscle and sinew and skin, and they're given breath to live again. These bones are revived. And Ezekiel 37 tells us something interesting about these bones. Ezekiel 37 verse 11 tells us that these bones are representative of the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, our bones are dried and our hope is lost. We are cut off for our parts. This is what the nation would be like when they were scattered throughout the whole world after AD 70. But Ezekiel 37 verse 14, just a few verses later, says that they would be revived. God says, I will put my spirit in you and ye shall live. I shall place you in your own land. And ye shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken it and performed it, saith the Lord. And so these bones were figuratively going to be brought back from the dead, and the nation would inherit their own land that was promised to them again. Just as in the vision, where the bones became living beings again, this seemingly dry and dead nation would be resurrected and brought back into their land. And then later on in verse 21 and 22, we have a follow-up where God says, "Behold, I will take the children of Israel from among the heathen, whither they be gone, and will gather them on every side and bring them into their own land. And I will make them one nation in the land, upon the mountains of Israel, and one king shall be king to them all. They shall no more be two nations, neither shall they be divided into two kingdoms any more." And so the diaspora, as they were called, would be united in their land to be a nation at some point. They would no longer be a northern and a southern division of Israel and Judah. They would become one Israel, and they would be in their own land. That's what Ezekiel 37 tells us. Now, there's another prophecy, a more minor prophet in the scripture, but that doesn't mean their message isn't any less important. And in Amos 9, in verses 11 to 15, we're not going to read through those, but we're going to pick out what those verses tell us. In those verses, we're told that the Jews would return and they would build the ruined and wasted temple. So when it was destroyed in AD 70, they were going to eventually build it back up. They would possess their land that had been previously filled with other nations. Remember, that's what the Assyrians did. They brought 5 other nations in, and they became the Samaritans in the Jews' land. But they were going to repossess it. It says in Amos that they would experience great prosperity and wealth and riches. It says they would build their waste cities and live there. And then finally it says that they would remain in their land forever, just as was promised to Abraham and to Jacob. So that's Amos 9. We're going to look at one of those verses later on, God willing. But those are what Amos 9 is telling us. And then our last prophecy we want to look at is in Ezekiel 38. And this one might be a little more bleak because, like I said in our brief historical summary, the Jews and their land have always been a hot commodity, and it's going to be no different in the future. There's going to be this northern invading nation called Gog that's going to come for them. In Ezekiel 38, we read of that. It says that Gog will come from thy place out of the north parts, thou and many people with thee, all of them upon horses, a great company, mighty army. It says they shall come up against my people of Israel. They shall come as a cloud to cover the land. So we know that Israel has to be in their land. It shall be in the latter days that I will bring thee against my land, and the heathen may know me, when I shall be sanctified in thee, O Gog, before their eyes. Now, ultimately, when Gog comes against the land, they're going to be destroyed. They're going to be saved by God sending his son to save the Jewish people. But Israel has to be in their land for this mighty nation, Gog, to come and cover the land, for God to bring them against the land to then demonstrate his power. And so we know, or Bible scholars knew, that Israel would have to be back in their own land. And there's way more prophecy. Like I said, Ezekiel 34, verse 13 is one. Jeremiah 31 has one. Ezekiel 36 also has one. And the list goes on and on. We're going to see a long list in one of the quotes we're going to look at in a second. But Bible scholars knew these prophecies. And they knew that the promises to Abraham and Jacob demanded that Israel would return to their homeland again. They just had to be there for God's purpose to be fulfilled. And yet for almost 2,000 years, they had been uprooted from the land. They had been slowly attempted to be assimilated into cultures worldwide. Surely hope was dimming, and people were giving up. The bones would be dry and dead forever. But this isn't the case for people who are looking into their Bibles. One of these people, I think, we'll all recognize as Sir Isaac Newton. Now we all know this name. He's a huge name in physics for his 3 laws of motion and numerous scientific discoveries. But he also studied the Bible. And he wrote in this really long book title here, Observations upon Prophecies of Daniel and the Apocalypse of St. John, in 2 parts. Notice the date there, written in 1733. So that was hundreds of years ago. And he writes this: since the commandment to return and to build Jerusalem precedes the Messiah, the Prince, 49 years, it may perhaps come forth not from the Jews themselves, but from some other kingdom friendly to them, and precede their return from captivity and give occasion to it. And lastly, that this rebuilding of Jerusalem and the waste places of Judah is predicted, and then he goes into all those passages there, and that the return from captivity and coming of the Messiah and his kingdom are described in another number of prophecies and many other places of Scripture. The manner I know not, let time be the interpreter. So if we kind of sort through this quote here, at the beginning, he's basically saying that the return of the Jews to the land in Daniel, one of the prophecies, can't be referring to the return of Ezra and Nehemiah under the king of Persia, Cyrus, because those are before the days of Jesus, and they don't match with the prophecy. So he's saying that can't be the return that's being prophesied about. There has to be another time when a kingdom friendly to them is going to help them come back into their own land and build Jerusalem and the waste cities, and then Christ is going to return. And that's what Sir Isaac Newton says about the restoration of Israel. He says it has to come, and it has to come before Christ's return, and it has to come with help from a friendly nation. Now, the next person we're going to quote here is another Newton. I'm not sure of the relation, but this is a bishop named Thomas Newton. And in 1754, Thomas Newton wrote in Dissertations on the Prophecies, quoting a prophecy in Luke 21, that when the times of the Gentiles shall be fulfilled, then the expression implies that the Jews shall be restored. And for what reason can we believe that though they are dispersed among all nations, yet by a constant miracle they are kept distinct from all, but for the further manifestation of God's purpose toward them? The prophecies have been accomplished to the greatest exactness in the destruction of their city that happened in AD 70, and it's continuing still subject to strangers when the Romans were trying to get rid of the influence of the Jews. In the dispersion of their people, they were scattered across the world, and their living still separate from all peoples. They still kept their culture in all these different pockets. Why should not the remaining parts of the same prophecies be as fully accomplished too, Thomas says, in their restoration at the proper season when the times of the Gentiles shall be fulfilled? So here's another man who was studying his Bible, and he looked at these prophecies and he said, all the other things happened. Surely they're also going to be restored again. And he didn't know when, but he said this would happen based on Scripture. And then our last quote that we're going to look at is quite later on in 1849, which is still so long ago to us. And this is Dr. John Thomas in Elpis, Israel. And he writes, the pre-adventual, so that's before Christ's return, colonization of Palestine will be purely on political principles. And the Jewish colonists will return in unbelief of the messiahship of Jesus and of the truth as it is in him. They will emigrate thither as agriculturalists and traders in the hope of ultimately establishing their commonwealth, but more immediately of getting rich in silver and gold by commerce with India. Remember, Amos said that they were going to be very prosperous, and in cattle and goods by their industry at home, under the efficient protection of the British power. And so Dr. John Thomas agrees with Sir Isaac Newton that there's going to be a friendly nation who's going to help them come home and establish their land. And these three men who studied their Bibles and wrote on these prophecies, they all predicted from those prophecies that Israel was going to return. God would bring them back into their land and establish them as a nation again. And all of these happened 100 years before Israel actually became a state. So there was no hindsight here. This was all looking forward, basing it off the Bible. And sure enough, the prophecies from the Bible that were referenced by these Bible scholars came true, slowly but surely. And it started in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration, when the former British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour wrote a letter to a prominent British Zionist named Lord Walter Rothschild. And in this declaration, he pledged support from Great Britain for re-establishing Israel. Just like Dr. John Thomas said, just like Sir Isaac Newton said, someone was going to help the Jews. And in World War I, later that same year, the British General Allenby captured Jerusalem from the Ottoman Turks. And they were in support of the Germans in World War I, and they were obviously then on the opposite side of the war than the British were. And so the British come in and they take Jerusalem from the Turks. Then, over the years of 1917 to 1947, there's a worldwide Jewish immigration. As Jews could see that their home was maybe about to be restored, there's this sense that they were going to become a nation again. And so it happened. On November 29th, 1947, the UN voted in favor of the state of Israel being established, along with the state of Palestine. And officially declared, Israel was officially declared as a state on May 14th, 1948. And this fulfilled the prophecies that were prophesied thousands of years before in the Bible, that were commented on hundreds of years before by Bible scholars who knew that God's purpose relied on the people of Israel being in, or the Jewish people, being in the land of Israel. And so we might come to the end of the story, and now we go, what's next? Well, I think what's next, and we can look at this story, we can have our faith bolstered, and we can take a little page out of Thomas Newton's book. Because now we can add another thing to the list of prophecies that have been fulfilled. The Jewish people have returned to Israel and become a nation. And so if we look at the next prophecies, the return of Christ is something that's going to come next. And why should we not believe that that's going to happen if all these other things came to pass as well? And this is going to include the resurrection of Abraham and Jacob, and they're going to inherit the land that they were promised. And so God is not done with his people Israel. So why should we not believe the prophecy of Jesus' return to them won't come true as well? And so we wait for that amazing day to come, and we pray that we can be a part of God's people when it eventually does.
Hey, well, thank you so much, Jake, for all that insight. I think it's really helpful to look at just, I guess, what are just a few of the prophecies that were predicted, that predicted in advance the Jews' return. But I think the most amazing part is to see that Bible scholars could read those prophecies and actually predict what was going to happen before it came to pass. And I guess that's some inspiration for us to be able to look at the Bible and see what's going to happen next. Now, before we return back to this topic of Israel's rebirth, let's take for a moment one of our weekly segments where we look at the commandments of Christ and look for short practical lessons designed to help us apply these principles in our everyday life. Tonight's segment, I think, is especially relevant. It's called Seek Peace Over Spreading Gossip.
Have you ever been in a group of people talking about someone who isn't there? Well, if you've done so in a way that somehow discredits or damages the reputation of that person, then you've participated in gossip. While on the surface, gossip seems like a relatively harmless activity, the Apostle Peter makes it out to be much more serious when he associates it with issues like robbery and even murder. That comparison should stop us in our tracks. Why would the Bible place gossip in the same category as such serious sins? Well, it's because gossip isn't just speaking about somebody else, it's tearing down another person who is made in the image of God. In very blunt terms, it's spiritual murder. So what should we do when we're tempted to talk about someone else? Well, first, if we're going to talk about someone who isn't present, the goal should be to encourage, not to tear down. Paul says, "Let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good, to the use of edifying, that it might minister grace to the hearers." But even more effective is to speak to that person face to face. You might have noticed that gossip often arises because we take an issue with somebody else. and rather than speaking with them directly to resolve the problem, we tell everyone else about how much it bothers us. However, Jesus presents the proper alternative when he says, "If thy brother shall trespass against thee, go and tell him his fault between thee and him alone. If he shall hear thee, thou hast gained thy brother." So instead of talking about people, Jesus calls us to talk to them, privately, lovingly, and with the goal of building up. Ultimately, our words have the power to harm or to heal. And as followers of Jesus, we're called to choose words that build up, not that tear down.
Right. Well, thank you again to the team that produces those videos. Such an important reminder. I'm just always amazed at how much practical advice we receive from the Lord Jesus Christ. A real practical thing to speak directly to others, not about them in a derogatory manner. So another practical lesson we can try to implement this coming week. Just a reminder, all of our past segments and all of our session recordings are available on our Bible Unlocked replay channel on YouTube, and you can find a link to that channel on our website. So now we're going to get back to our main topic tonight and just dig a little bit deeper with Jake. And Jake, once again, thank you so much for that well thought out presentation. I think for me, that modern miracle of Israel is the most convincing proof of God's foreknowledge, that he predicted that thousands of years in advance. And it's fulfilled in relatively modern times. Not in my lifetime, I guess, but perhaps in the lifetime of some of our attendees. But you might have mentioned this a little bit, but some people look at these prophecies about Israel and they want to say that they just pointed to the Jews returning from Babylon. I wonder if you could just explain a little bit more why you believe they point to a modern restoration, like in the last couple hundred years.
Yeah, I think you even saw that back in the 1700s when Isaac Newton was writing about it, because he brought that up and kind of combated it. And I think one of the main reasons here comes from Amos chapter 9. I mentioned we'd come back to that. And in Amos chapter 9, verse 15, it says that God will plant them upon their land, and they shall no more be pulled up out of their land, which I have given them. That's what God told the people. He told Amos to prophesy. And it has to do also with what we considered with the promises to Abraham and Jacob at the very beginning, that the promises to inherit this land would last forever. And in that verse, they will no more be pulled up out of their land. And if you remember during that brief history lesson that we went over, when the Jews returned from Babylonian captivity, they eventually had their land taken over again during AD 70. And this then led to the longest period that they had of being scattered. And so that certainly isn't them being established in their land and no more pulled up, because they very literally did get pulled back out of their land. And then in another prophecy of this regathering that we didn't go to, Ezekiel 34, we're told that they would come from the countries, plural countries, and will bring them to their own land. And in Ezekiel 37, we read about them coming from every side back into the land. So there's an emphasis in these prophecies on these people being brought back to Israel from worldwide countries, and not just the Babylonian captivity where they were taken and eventually allowed to return under Nehemiah and Ezra. That was just from one place, whereas these prophecies speak to a worldwide regathering from where they had been scattered. So I think those two ideas kind of help combat that thought that maybe it was already established before 1948.
Yeah, I think that's helpful clarifications, and those are some pretty powerful points. Maybe for me, it emphasizes the importance of reading carefully. I think you could go over those points very quickly and miss them and see that, it's an idea that they have to keep it forever, and that they're coming back from different nations, just not from Babylon. Another question for you. You mentioned that Bible students like Isaac Newton and John Thomas expected a Jewish return long before it happened. And I'm just wondering, why is it so important, the timing there, that they saw it in advance? And maybe before you answer, I want to get everybody involved like we have in past sessions. Um, if Bible students, just as an audience question, which you can enter in the chat, if Bible students could accurately foresee Israel's restoration centuries in advance, what do you as Bible students look forward to seeing fulfilled as well? What else have you seen in the Bible that will need to be fulfilled in the near future? So maybe go ahead and type those in, and I'll come back to your responses after Jake responds to, why is the timing of them seeing it in advance so important?
Yeah, well, if you remember that timeline we looked at, when Israel became a nation, it was 1948. And if we want to be generous, we can go back to 1917 when the idea started to, germinate with the Balfour Declaration, and it started to gain some traction. But these Bible students wrote in such detail about this state being formed as far back as 1733. That's when Isaac Newton wrote about it. And that's over 200 years before it happened, and about 200 years before the idea even got proposed in the first place. And so this wasn't a hindsight interpretation of scripture, going back and seeing, oh yeah, I can see how that, works out with what happened. That's what we're doing. But they were doing this before it even happened, and they predicted it so accurately in their writings. And these men weren't political Zionists either. They had no pull to Judaism or Jewish nationality. They were just reading their Bible, and they didn't have any say in bringing it to pass either. They were just neutral observers of biblical prophecy, and they got it bang on. And I think that's kind of where the power lies, not only in how far back they wrote about it, but also that they didn't really have a horse in the race, so to speak. They just looked at it from a neutral observer standpoint, and that's what the Bible was telling them.
Yeah. I can just picture being somebody living in the 1930s and like reading those prophecies from Bible students and seeing where they got it from the Bible. And then when 1948 happened, it would just be totally impressive. Now, I'm not that old, but a similar thing happened in my life where, Bible students, people I attended church with were from Bible prophecy saying that the UK would be outside of the European Union. I guess that would be a different class to explain where they were getting that from. But I can then remember the day that the vote took place, and sure enough, the UK voted to be out. And it's like, wow, that's powerful that we can predict events by knowing a little bit about the Bible.
Absolutely.
Some good answers coming in here. Certainly getting the point that if the Bible prophesied the Jews would return, then other things the Bible prophesies are going to come true. We've got the return of Christ, obviously, that's wonderful. Bailey and Mo point out that Jeremiah was predicted that he would have an inheritance in the land. That'll be cool to meet Jeremiah. It maybe points to what I was thinking to put with the return of Christ would be the resurrection. If we've lost any loved ones, we can certainly look forward to the resurrection taking place. Look at that. Matthew's got that in there. I should read ahead. That Jesus will return, and Brother Ardon there points out some of the conditions that will take place before Jesus returns. So as we see things taking place in the earth and the world around us, it gives us confidence. So thank you everybody for your input. You got another minute or two if there's anything else you'd like to add there. I'm going to just ask Jake one last question before we wrap up this evening. Cool topic, but what does Israel's restoration mean for us personally? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because, it has to mean something. It has to, change our lives in some way. And I think it's a good time to drive home that point that we kind of ended with that last slide. If the Bible got this right, along with so many other things that we don't have time to go into, one of them that you mentioned there about Britain leaving the European Union. And in this long list of things that the Bible correctly prophesied, then we have to believe that the prophecy of Jesus' return and establishing of the kingdom is going to happen. there's really no choice for us because everything else has been so accurately prophesied that this is just going to happen. And it's been talked about for thousands of years. Maybe you feel like the hope is getting a bit dry and fading a bit, like that valley of dry bones. But God has a purpose, and He has a time that is in mind. He hasn't left us in the dark while we wait. He's given us prophecies to paint a picture of what's going to happen in that day, the things that'll lead up to it, and how we can get there and experience it ourselves. So even if we have to wait another 1900 years, like the Jews waited for their land to be restored, it's going to happen. It's just a matter of time. So I think the point that I would take away is to try and use that time to study the Bible like those Bible students of old were, so that we're ready to inherit the promises when they're fulfilled, and we can see them taking place, and not be left sleeping is what the Bible calls it. That we might be able to watch for the of Christ to come.
All right. Well, once again, on everyone's behalf, thank you, Jake, for joining us tonight and your insights. I think seeing how prophecy unfolds in history is truly inspiring and gives us confidence that God and his angels are still in control of this world. Thank you to everybody that's joined us this evening and have shared your thoughts in the chat. We truly do appreciate your participation. We're going to invite you back next Thursday. So next Thursday, we continue our study and our proofs of why the Bible is something that we can believe. And next week's topic is how can we really know there is a God?